I'm Jason Johnson, Managing Director here at Compeer Financial. I work with our Food and Ag group as well as our swine group. Today here I'm going to take a closer look at the ethanol industry, how COVID-19 has affected the supply chain, and what it means for agriculture. We know that you're all facing some time of uncertainty and volatility in our industry and in all of our lives. Farmers are an essential worker, and you all continue to do the hard work of producing food for our country amidst a global pandemic. We thank you for the work that you do and hope that you gain some helpful insights from our discussion here today. So if you have questions, please send them in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them as they come in. And if we run out of time, we'll make every effort to provide responses in the comments after the video concludes. So as you can see, I'm working here in my home office, adjusting to the new realities as we all are, such as not traveling as much and not wearing my work clothes as often. This morning I put on this dress shirt, and judging by my dry cleaning basket, it's the first time I've worn a button-down shirt in quite some time. So I guess that's one good thing to come out of doing this. So one of the other things that's new for me is connecting with people in platforms like this, Facebook Live event. There was some discussion about my family doing a TikTok video at some point as we were bored in the house bored, as some of those say. But at this point, I'm happy to say there is no Johnson family TikToks out there for anybody to view. So with that, I think my wife and kids have left the house, so hopefully we'll be fairly quiet in here. My new office mate, Quinn, the family dog, has promised to sleep through this. Hopefully we can have a good discussion. So with that, I guess we'll kind of get into it. Here at Compeer, we monitor several industries across the food supply chain, and companies that we serve and individuals that we serve to understand what's going on and help our clients navigate what's going on in the marketplace. So there's no denying that ethanol production is a major part of that demand, especially for our corn farmers. It's essential to our fuel supply chain, but also the byproducts that are out there are important to our livestock clients. And certainly we found out that CO2 is very important to the food supply chain, food processing, cold storage, certainly the sodas that we all drink. And now we're also seeing that it can have a major impact or helps solve some of the problems that we're having around hand sanitizers. Again, something I never would have foreseen as we've entered into 2020, which seems like a long time ago at this point. So, certainly we've seen and had to navigate the COVID-19 environment. And as we looked at this and saw what was happening, ethanol was certainly the tip of the spear for agriculture. The industry was hit, basically, I'll call it a double black swan event. First, an OPEC-driven event that drove swift decline in oil prices and certainly motor fuel prices and certainly ethanol price. And then that was quickly followed by unprecedented demand deterioration for driving in the U.S. and around the world, related to a shelter-in-place orders that not only in the U.S. but again Europe and all over the world was experiencing. So during the last few weeks, we've seen ethanol production fall for 8 consecutive weeks, according to EIA data, something that we monitor weekly. And since March 13th, ethanol production basically has dropped off 46%. Current estimates for total idled and reduced production capacity are over 50% of normal for ethanol plants. And last week, I think we fell to an extremely low 560-some thousand barrels last week. So that was a new historic low. Meanwhile, despite this lower production, we also had inventories rise at the same time to a record 27.7 million barrels before they finally started to ratchet down last week. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in our conversation. But certainly as that is a setup, we are certainly in unprecedented times for ethanol, but really everything right now. So as we have this discussion, I want to step back and kind of look at the macro environment of what happened in a pre-COVID situation, to see the larger picture and see what was happening in the industry leading up, because I think that's important to understand about how we might actually come out of this on the other end and what ethanol industry may look like. So as we go back and look at it, the industry was already sitting on a pretty historic supply of ethanol, and we're working in a fairly low margin environment, and one where we were already seeing plants idle. We were already seeing some cutback in production, and some of this was certainly due to corn availability throughout the Midwest, but others were just simply competitiveness in a overall oversupplied marketplace. So in total, we have over 17 billion gallons of production capacity in the U.S. And again, going back to that March 13th date, production was about 15.9 billion gallons per year. So already under 94% of utilization, excluding the roughly 1.2 billion gallons that were known idled at that time. And then obviously then we saw a massive decrease the rest of March. So the industry, why did the industry grow to what it was? Certainly it was growing into an additional export demand that was increasing for 4 straight years leading up to 2019, when we finally drew back about 14% off that high. So certainly that was a great motivator towards expanding the industry. Domestic demand is certainly tied to gasoline demand, and roughly about 10% of that demand throughout the year. And increases beyond that simply have been getting greater E15 usage, E85. And there had been some momentum around that, but certainly it's been a slow growth factor to date. So prior to the shelter-in-place orders, the U.S. was on pace to match last year's consumption domestically, roughly 14.3 billion gallons. An additional 1.6 billion gallons of expected exports. So production was already expected to outpace domestic demand in 2020, even prior to the outbreak. So in a pre-COVID environment, the supply-demand equation was already tilted towards oversupply from potential capacity situations. So you kind of need to know what we were having going into it to kind of understand the dramatic effect that kind of happened post-COVID-19. So we saw the shelter-in-place announcements come in throughout the U.S., and the impacts to both domestic and demand and export demand. Ethanol usage is obviously tied closely to that gasoline demand. So once we saw negative gasoline usage, we saw a pullback of ethanol just as quickly. By April 6th, an additional 41 plants had gone in for annual production of 3.2 billion gallons were idled. There are roughly 66 plants that were running at a reduced output, and a collective 1.8 billion gallons overall. So a total of 5.8 billion gallons came offline in 3 quick weeks. So I went back and looked, and the last time I filled with gas was March 20th. I think when I maybe fill my tank later this week, so that's about 6 weeks without going any time of filling my gas tank. Typically I'm traveling, so I fill up a couple times a week. Again, traveling for work, running kids around to different events on weekends, used up a lot of gasoline. EIA data tracks this very well, but certainly my own personal usage was down roughly 200 gallons that I would have used over this time. And I printed off a chart to kind of show, obviously, these are not charts you like to see, but ones that we're getting used to is just dramatic changes in comparison to what we had seen before. But certainly you take your own personal and then expand it, you can feel that demand deterioration that was happening. So as the stay-in-place environment has continued, the initial drawbacks in supply were not enough to really counteract what was happening in an overall inventory situation. And so inventories, even as we took production off, continue to increase across the United States for ethanol and gasoline, quite honestly. And so as we looked at that, I printed off a very busy chart, but look at this. I mean, obviously we had inventory going up at the same time, we had that much production coming offline. And so obviously that dynamic was very important to understand what was going on. So every plant, I think it's important to note, will have its own models that they look at from an economic standpoint, when to run, when to idle, when to pull back. And they were running those things, but certainly as we ran out of places, as inventory was coming up, we ran out of places to store that ethanol. And that was certainly an impact to pulling more gallons offline. Because you can make it, but you have to have some place to store it, whether it be, so if you don't have your tanks, you don't have the rail cars, and you don't have the ultimate storage tanks out there, your situation was forced to pull back on that production here in the recent weeks. So again, industry drawn back, production grew back even across the last 4 weeks, and we've ultimately got to about half of production capacity online, or running, I should say. And so that's the lowest level of U.S. Production since EIA even began reporting this, which I believe was somewhere back in 2010. So pretty historic. And certainly we got to a point, I think it's as of last week, and again, these numbers continue to change every week when we get the reports, but so of last week, approximately 70 ethanol facilities with an annual production capacity of 6.2 billion gallons were fully idled, and nearly 70 more plants are running at a reduced operating rate by a combined 2 billion gallons. So roughly in total, that's 8.2 billion gallons altogether. So if you go back from what we were talking about before, roughly 16 billion gallons, we're at half that capacity. So this cutback was obviously unprecedented, and certainly the depth and the speed happening over the last 8 weeks, was also unprecedented. So certainly as we look at this, it's going to continue to affect other industries, right? What we're seeing is all industries are somewhat tied together. And so one of the things that we looked at, obviously, was corn producers were going to begin to see the impact as plants slowed or idled. And the initial thing you probably saw was the widening of the basis, as the plants needed less corn. In many cases, they had corn already owned that was sufficient to run at slower rate, much less at an idled rate. And so those basis levels widened. And so with ethanol making up roughly 40% of domestic use of corn, its deterioration demand was bound to have effect on corn basis. And eventually it was going to have an effect on price, as roughly today's conversion rates, whatever you want to use, roughly 2.9 gallons of ethanol, we'll get that out of 1 bushel of corn. So with that conversion rate, you can kind of step back and look at what that would mean for usage on our corn. So again, the economics go far beyond just what was going to happen in the ethanol sector. I think I went back and looked. If you go back March 10th, we were running at corn prices just around $3.70 a bushel. And today, again this week, and these are always moving targets, we're under $3.20 a bushel. And at basis levels, you go across and you look, they're going to be well under $3 in many areas across the country already. So, and that's, certainly we saw some of the impact of that was just the planting intentions on what was going to happen on corn this year. I think they had it around 97 million acres across the U.S. So, even on the USDA report back in April, I think the report showed a reduction of 375 million bushels for this marketing year, which would have taken ethanol bushels down to around 5 billion bushels. At this point, I think that's a pretty optimistic view of the world as it relates to corn, given that estimates have usage of about 12 billion gallons for ethanol, and for exports to drop from that 1.6 to, again, depending on the economic forecast, 1 billion gallons, maybe a little less for exports. And certainly we'll see some of that come back into the demand as it relates to livestock rations, as DDGs become less available out in the marketplace, and operators look for alternatives. And if you I think we did one last week. If you want to see some more information on that, you can look at what my colleague Kent Bang said on a Facebook Live last week for a swine update. And certainly there's a lot of other information to kind of go out there and see what's happening in that sector. So as a quick side note, as we talk about swine there, I'm continually amazed at what's happening and the connectedness of many aspects of our economy and how it's being highlighted in this COVID-19 environment, especially around our food supply chain. And as I look particularly to ethanol, it's not just the ethanol production and the impact on DDGs for our livestock producers, but also, again, going back to that CO2 and how it's used and have an effect on food processing, meat plants, water filtration in the state of Iowa. It's amazing just how interconnected and how some of these byproducts are very, very important to other industries. And it's not just ethanol. There's a lot of other places we're seeing that as well. So with that, I'm going to kind of move on into what are the longer term impacts, because I think certainly the short term we're already feeling. So for sure we saw the impacts here in the last couple weeks and months, but the big question really for demand as it relates to ethanol really goes back to what are your thoughts as far as driving demand and when that comes back. And what does normalcy look like? And that's probably going to be really out into 2021, and it could even be beyond. So really, we've already started seeing a little bit of it with initial easing of some of the restrictions on the economy and some of the demand improvement we've seen, but it's very limited. But at least it's a sign, at least as I'm kind of thinking about the ethanol industry, that maybe we finally hit the bottom. But even at that, it looks to be a long road to hit normal gasoline demand, and ethanol will actually, in my opinion, be a little bit slower. Again, talking about those inventory levels that were out there leading up to this. And so my expectation, and I think I've heard this from others, would definitely be more of a U-shape versus a V-shaped demand curve for ethanol to come back. So, and all of these scenarios that you would look at all depend on what do you think driving demand looks like. I can look at a lot of different models, but really it's anyone's best guess. And as I look into 2021, and will that look as closer to normal, I think we'll still be under the 2020 initial projections for gasoline usage in the United States. And for exports, short of something major like a major importer like China bringing in several million gallons, I don't see a lot of change to this dynamic. Because as we mentioned, we're in an oversupplied situation. So it may be great time before we see some plants come back and can justify coming back online. I think the EIA data for 2020 had December still down 15% from previous years. So that's several months out, and I still had that one at 15% down from previous years. So certainly that's going to feed into 2021, short of a vaccine or something like that happening. So I think it'll be interesting to think how companies think about employees even going back to work. And will back to work be what it was before? Will we have as many people driving, or will there be more people working from home long term? So I think those are things that we have to think about as we look at driving demand. And probably just overall we have to be just very, very comfortable that normal may not be what normal was ahead of COVID-19. And those are things that I continue to rack my brain around, and every time I think about it, I think of a new thing that might be impactful to one of our industries that we serve. So a couple of the good things that I just think are worth noting for everyone out there is just where this industry, ethanol industry, was, at least from a health perspective going into this. We did have some good years, some average years that was very good for the industry that helped strengthen balance sheets, strengthen liquidity positions. Certainly those are first line of defense for any industry. But also it allowed them to do things like make upgrades into efficiencies into their plant, certainly make returns back to their shareholders, which is obviously good for rural America. But those are the good things that were really in place at this point versus last time there was an ethanol downturn over a decade ago at this point. So, so while the immediate impacts were harsh for the industry, sending margins significantly negative in general, we also did see just a slight increase this last couple of weeks as we come off those high inventory levels. And so that's a good thing. However, I would say and caution that we still were well above where we are historically from those inventory levels, and we're still having production levels at under 50% of capacity. So we'll have to see as capacity comes back online, are those margins able to hold? So certainly we're a long ways from where we need to be from an industry perspective, and to bring more gallons back online. So basically with that, I'm not exactly sure when production will ramp back up, but I do know the plants will largely look for those economic drivers that we just talked about there, or decide when to ramp up production. For some, that'll be soon. For others, that'll take some time. And to reiterate my previous point, I believe there will be more of a U-shaped versus V-shaped curve to this as far as additional demand coming through. So certainly I'm going to look here and see if there's any questions coming through. So there's some questions here along the lines of contracts and for byproducts and how those are being, if I'm kind of reading it right, how those are being handled throughout the industry. And I would say that certainly there's a lot of different views on that, but one of them I would say most of the plants that we are working with are honoring those contracts. They're working out and reaching out to their farmers and those delivering corn to work out contract arrangements. I know there's some talk on force majeure and those type of things, but beyond a few of those names that were out there doing that, I have not heard that on a mass basis. But certainly I'd encourage you to reach out to the plant that you're working with or maybe selling to for more information as far as how they would be handling that. So we'll continue to monitor questions here and see if any others are coming through. So to kind of follow up and kind of finish this off, and I'll look for questions here. What are we doing at Compeer to kind of work through this? And you know, we always work with our clients and in the face of challenges. And this current situation is no different, and for ethanol, it's no different than how we work with any of our clients. We're going to try to find a way to help navigate through this. We have a variety of solutions that we can help work with clients, but every situation and every individual situation is going to be different. So the biggest thing I would say, and this is really not only in ethanol but in any client relationship, the biggest thing is communication between the RM and the client. And in these times, it's more important than ever, because one thing I've seen is whatever I thought one week, we might find something new the following week that's happening in this environment. And so communication is just really going to be the key, not only in those relationships with the finance company, but really all your relationships, to make sure everybody is understanding what's going on. And kind of my final point here is to remember there was an ethanol industry leading into this. There's an ethanol industry today, and there's going to be an ethanol industry on the other end of this. But what that industry looks like on the other end, it's going to be different. And there may be some that don't make it through this. And that is just the simple reality of what we might be working at and looking at here. And so what normal is may not be normal in a post-COVID environment. And I think that's just something we have to be very, very comfortable with and try to see how we navigate through that situation. And so I'm going to leave you with this, and that there are two sayings that I picked up over the years that are relevant to the ethanol industry and really any industry that we work in. And that is, those that do it best will get to continue to do it in the future, right? That it's really, even if you take your sports, right? Those that continue to do it best get to keep on moving on to the next level, as an analogy, but it's still the same thing here. If you want to continue to do it, you need to be the best at doing it and work yourself to being the best, to be relevant in the future, especially when times like this come up. And the second is there will be better margins in the future. But in order to take advantage of those margins, you're going to have to be present to take advantage of those opportunities. That means having things like strong balance sheets, availability of liquidity, strong management teams that can navigate through these volatile times, and certainly having good partners to work with to help you navigate those challenges. And I think those things, if you keep those in mind, I think it's important at any time, but certainly in volatile times. So I guess I'll look for questions, but not seeing any additional right now. I appreciate everyone that took the time to hear my thoughts. Again, we at Compeer appreciate everything that our clients are doing and look forward to continuing to serve you as trusted advisors in the marketplace. And certainly look forward to getting out and meeting with our clients again in person here soon. So with that, I appreciate everybody's time and have a great rest of your lunch hour.